Okay, so hello class, this is Dr. Metzger with your American Federal Government class online. I'm going to do new PowerPoint slides this semester, new lectures for them. So let us begin and get in here and look at, I'm going to go through this somewhat quickly, more quickly than I would if I were doing, if we were doing this in class for obvious reasons, okay? Your textbook is good. You can look at these in PowerPoint and have more time with them and everything else, or look at them in Blackboard and have more time with them. What is government? Here is a definition from the textbook, basically, the means by which a society organizes itself and allocates authority in order to accomplish collective goals and provide benefits that the society as a whole needs, okay? So a couple of things to notice or to highlight from that definition, okay? Focus on authority there, a common definition of the modern state that it has a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence. So it has some authority. Government, when we're talking about what is government, the other part there, collective goals, collective action. So it's something that we're doing collectively, but it has a specific authority. It's not just a voluntary association. We'll see with social contract theory, there is kind of a view that ultimately it is voluntary, or it should be, but it has a certain authority that other types of organizations or other types of partnerships or collective groups do not have, okay? So it has a certain authority, but it's also about collective action, things that we're trying to do collectively through government that we could not necessarily do as well as individuals, okay? Examples of the goals pursued by governments, security, obviously, something that almost every government is trying to provide in one way or another for its citizens, for itself. Safety, prosperity. These are things that governments pursue in different ways through different policies. There are different levels of expectation of how much they might provide that for their citizens or their subjects in the case of other types of governments, okay? Again, I'm going to go through this somewhat quickly here. What is politics? Another definition here, the process of gaining and exercising control within a government for the purpose of setting and achieving particular goals, especially those related to the division of resources within a nation. Okay, so two somewhat well-known definitions of politics there. Who gets what, when, how? Harold Lasswell focused really on who gets what kind of resources, how, through Congress, through the government. Okay, a question of who is kind of basically material resources, how are they being distributed? Maybe a somewhat narrow view of what politics actually is. Another definition, the authoritative allocation of values for a society. So they're a little bit more on the focus of values, principles, ideals, the way that that expresses itself through politics, okay? How much do we care about freedom? How much do we care about equality? What do those things look like? If we say that we care a lot about freedom or equality or justice, however we define that, how do we actually put that into practice? How do we actually realize that? Through government institutions, through government practices, through particular laws, through particular situations that we try to create, through the government, through the action of politics, okay? So the focus, and we'll see, I mean, oftentimes politics probably is more than people necessarily maybe want to think. Oftentimes it does look a lot more like that first definition, just who gets what, when, how, and we'll come back, we'll see different examples of that throughout the semester. We'll see different examples of times when even very grand, very kind of matters of pure principle, when they get translated into actually being actually put into a particular legal legislative form, and then what it takes to actually pass them, it ends up there's a lot of, well, who's going to get this and who's going to get that, and how are you going to get people on board with that? So certainly that's a very common thing, especially when you look at politics in the sense of legislation and the way that certain things get through Congress or do not get through Congress and actually become law and actually start to change the political landscape and the lives of people. But underlying that, also this idea of the values for a society, what are they? How do they balance or how do they compete with each other? If they do compete with each other, how do we balance them out? And what does that look like? What does that look like in concrete terms? So politics, more than just giving stuff or, figuring out who gets which part of the pie, when and how, also the principles, the ideas underlying that distribution, as well as kind of broader, more fundamental questions of what is justice, what should society look like, things like that, okay? So quick definitions of government and politics. Some of this may be, not that surprising to you. Some of you, I know a lot of times people come in and they say, I really dislike government, or I really dislike, U.S. government when I took it in high school or whatever. So, just something, a way for you to get a handle on it a little bit, okay? Another quotation, definition, description from the book. Politics is the process by which choices are made regarding how resources will be allocated and which economic and social policies government will pursue. So again, kind of a useful definition, again, back to that idea of who gets what, when, how. Again, also though, the values, the principles, the ideas according to which these decisions will be made. So individualism versus equality, examples of things that are freedom versus equality. Things that we value in American society and American political life. Very old part of American political identity. There's individualism and freedom. Also equality. How are those two things in tension? Even more obviously, freedom versus order or security, okay? You go back to the September 11th attacks, and especially a dramatic example of that. Right after the attacks, something called the Patriot Act was passed, which gave the government a lot more power to investigate, to do things, investigating people within the United States and even American citizens. And as time went on, and right after the September 11th attacks, people kind of felt like, well, I'm much more interested in not having any more attacks like that, or even smaller scale ones, than I necessarily am with worrying about whether or not maybe I'm being somebody's listening into the phone when I'm talking, or this or that. Some of the other aspects of the Patriot Act. Over time, as time went on, and as there weren't any more terrorist attacks, people started to wonder, have we created a situation in which abuse is easy and maybe even inevitable with this Patriot Act? So then the focus on freedom, the focus on individual rights, on civil liberties, kind of came back more to the fore, and people became more concerned with that. So freedom versus order, freedom versus security. These are things that are sometimes in tension, and at different times, again, depending on what has just happened and how threatened people may feel, at times they are, as a whole, maybe more willing to give up some of their freedom, some of their civil liberties. The more secure they start to feel, the more they start to feel like, what, we need to sort of reassert some of these things. And that's a common interplay, or a common dynamic that happens throughout American history in different times. Okay, so a few other major points here, then we'll talk about the actual major institutions of the government. Pretty simple, pretty straightforward introduction here. Okay, of course, we have a representative democracy, not a direct democracy. Of course, in the United States, famous democracy, but we don't have a direct democracy like they did in, say, ancient Athens, where any citizen could just walk down to the assembly, make a speech, start a vote on a measure, propose something, make a speech, start a vote, and whoever was there would vote on it, decide whether or not it would become a law. Obviously, we have representative democracy. We elect representatives who write the laws and then vote on them. In a state like Oklahoma, where you have a fair number of state referenda, constitutional questions, then you do have the citizenry as a whole voting on whether this should become a constitutional amendment, or whether this should become law or should not. Even so, most laws that are written, budget, things like that, that are written and are handled in Oklahoma, are done by representatives. And of course, at the federal level, it's almost the national level, it's almost all done by representatives. So we have democracy. We all know that. We've all heard that, I'm sure. It's a representative democracy where we vote, where we elect representatives who then go and write the laws and then vote on whether or not they will actually become law. We'll talk a little bit more about that process in a second, okay? Rather than direct democracy where the citizens could just show up and propose whatever they wanted to, argue for it themselves, and then vote on whether or not that would happen. We also have liberal democracy. Again, we have democracy, majority rule, but legal protections for individual rights, minority rights, but even more individual rights. So we have a liberal democracy, we have majority rule, but especially in the Bill of Rights, right? Civil liberties, the first 10 amendments of the Constitution, there are clear restrictions on what the government can do, on what the majority can do. Yeah, certain types of speech might be unpopular, but they're protected by the First Amendment. Certain religions at times may become very unpopular with the public, but they're protected by the First Amendment. There might be times when the public would be perfectly happy with certain types of police investigations or certain things happening, but they are, the power of the government to do these things is limited by the Bill of Rights, okay? Flag burning is a classic example, right? Very controversial. A lot of students here at Cameron, a lot of people nationally think that flag burning should be illegal. But the Supreme Court has ruled very clearly it's a form of speech. It's symbolic speech, so it's not using actual words, but it is expressing something. Okay, so it is a form of speech which is protected by the First Amendment. So no matter how many people want to pass a law outlawing flag burning, it's protected by the First Amendment. Okay, so that's liberal democracy, not in the narrow sense that we sometimes talk about liberals in the context of American society, liberals or American politics, liberals versus conservative, liberals being more on kind of more on the Democrat side, conservatives being more on the Republican side. Everybody in this sense is a liberal in this much deeper sense, which goes back to the Enlightenment, figures like John Locke, the Constitution, Thomas Jefferson, people who are kind of really focused on the idea of individual liberties and thinking that government should really exist to protect those individual liberties. And therefore those individual rights, liberties, freedoms, whatever you want to call them, come first. They're primary. Government only exists to protect those, and that those individual freedoms or liberties are kind of the most fundamental thing. And therefore the power of government to act, government should always be acting for the sake of those liberties and freedoms. And it's also therefore limited by them. Again, that's a liberal democracy, a common thing. The United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, all kinds of modern democracies you would call liberal democracies because they have that same attitude or that same view of the relationship between the individual and individual freedoms and government, okay? So again, democracy, but it's liberal democracy, which means that the majority rule what the majority may want. What they're able to do is drastically limited by this protection for individual rights, okay? Which sometimes, the majority versus the minority, as we'll see in the Federalist Papers, they're concerned about the individual, but they also recognize there are groups, minority groups that will be on the wrong side of the majority, and you want to try to protect them as well, okay? Finally, we do have democracy, but of course the founders, the people who wrote the Constitution, were fairly distrustful of democracy. So they put a few things in there which ended up having a lot of influence today, even as these things have never quite, even as people today don't necessarily agree with the original reason for them. So they put in the Electoral College, right? The Electoral College is the body which actually elects the president. And the original idea was if the people elected the wrong type of person, if they elected a demagogue, someone who clearly temperamentally, intellectually, morally was not fit to be president, the electors, who were considered kind of an elite group of people who understood better, who would be chosen by state legislatures and which would understand politics and all kinds of other things a little bit better maybe than the average person, the electors, the Electoral College, would get together and vote for the right person. That has never happened. It's never actually happened that there was a clear winner in the national election and the Electoral College voted for somebody else, John Quincy Adams instead of Andrew Jackson, for instance. It has, of course, happened that the person who won the popular vote has not won the Electoral College. Because if you win the right combination of states, you can actually lose, you can actually get fewer votes nationally, but still win the Electoral College. Okay, so and of course it's happened twice in the past 20 years, in 2000 and in 2016. The original purpose for the Electoral College, very few people agree with now. Almost nobody thinks that we should just have a group of people who kind of again, it was designed to be kind of a last kind of safety valve, a check on democracy to make sure that the people had gotten it right. Almost nobody agrees with that. And even if they did, I'm not sure they would think that a group of electors chosen by state legislators is really the way to do that. But of course, it's in the Constitution, as we'll talk about in a couple of weeks, very difficult to actually amend the Constitution, so it's going to be very hard to get rid of. Originally, senators were elected by state legislatures as well. That doesn't change until the early 20th century. So there are different aspects that the founders were distrustful of democracy. They put certain things in the Constitution which were meant to sort of limit the democracy and limit the ability of the people to act, because they didn't necessarily think that they had the moral or the intellectual ability always to make the right decision, okay? And we'll see this, for instance, very clearly in Federalist number 10, where there's some real concern about what democracy would look like. And that we'll see this also as this plays out in the debates or the arguments between the Federalists on the one hand and the Anti-Federalists, who were more advocates of a more kind of pure, direct form of democracy, versus the Federalists, who were the advocates or the proponents for the Constitution and were a little bit more skeptical about democracy. They thought popular rule was necessary, but a little bit more skeptical about democracy, rule of the majority, etc., by itself. Okay. So those are some important things to remember, broad points about the United States government, things that you might, of course, it's a democracy, but what does that mean? Representative democracy, liberal democracy. So, representative democracy rather than direct democracy. We're electing representatives to do a lot of that work of actually writing and voting on laws. Liberal democracy, strong protections in the Constitution for individual rights, individual liberties, if that helps you remember that. And there are aspects, the founders were a little distrustful of democracy, and there are important features in the Constitution which remain. The senators being elected by state legislatures was eventually changed by a constitutional amendment, but the Electoral College is still here. There are a few other things, okay? So let's talk about the major institutions of the American government. For some of you, this might be very familiar. You may know all of this. Others of you, it might be a little hazy, since whenever you took you may kind of remember this and it might help you bring it back. Some of you might be largely new, or if you ever knew it, you've definitely forgotten it, okay? So let's start with Congress, okay? The basic thing that Congress does in the American government, Congress writes the laws and votes on them, okay? They don't become law, they actually write the bills, I guess, and then they vote on whether or not to send them to the president, okay? But Congress is, of course, the legislative branch. The simplest thing that they do is write the laws, okay? If you want to understand a very simple term, they're the legislative branch. And there are two houses of Congress, okay? Congress is the national legislative body, but it has two houses, two distinct bodies within it, okay? The Senate, sometimes called the upper house. In the Senate, there are equal representation by state, okay? So there are 100 total, 2 for each state. So each state has equal representation. California and Wyoming, Texas and Rhode Island, they have the same number of representatives, okay? 6-year terms, so they're relatively long terms, as we'll see when we talk a little bit more about Congress a little bit later in the semester. This is by design. These are meant to give the senators more time to learn their job, but also more freedom from public opinion. So 6-year terms, the minimum age is 30, okay? The House of Representatives, sometimes called the lower body, their representation is based on population, okay? So California has more representatives than Texas. Texas has more than Virginia. Virginia has more than Wyoming, and so on, okay? So in the House of Representatives, representation is based on population. There are 435 representatives. They have 2-year terms. There, the minimum age is 25, okay? House of Representatives, 2-year terms, that's not much time. And again, that is by design. The House of Representatives, they are meant to be basically constantly aware of what their constituents want. So again, we'll talk about this a little bit more when we talk about Congress, but by design, the idea is the House of Representatives is supposed to be extremely democratic, extremely aware of, extremely dependent on the people to get reelected every 2 years, and therefore very aware, always aware of what they want and what they're thinking and what their moods might be. The Senate, on the other hand, meant to be a little bit longer terms to kind of ride some of that out, to not have to worry as much about what the people think this month or even this year, okay? Other things about Congress, okay? The Senate has often called the upper house, not often, but can be. Basically, the Senate is considered better than the House of Representatives generally for most people, okay? They have longer terms, they have a little bit more prestige, and they have some important powers that they share with the president, okay? So the president appoints federal judges who have lifetime tenure, but they have to be confirmed by the Senate, and various important appointments to the executive branch, the cabinet, for instance. The president appoints them, but the Senate has to confirm them, okay? So a lot of these important federal appointments, the president makes the appointment, but the Senate has to actually confirm it, okay? And that, of course, is that principle of separation of powers or checks and balances. The president only has so much power in installing members of the federal government, whether it's federal judges who have lifetime tenure or members of the cabinet who may not even last his or her entire first term, but that power to appoint is shared with the Senate. Likewise, the president negotiates usually and signs treaties with other countries, but they have to be approved by the Senate with a 2/3 vote, which is somewhat difficult. So again, the ability to actually make formal, legally binding treaties with other countries, the president does a lot of the negotiating and actually signs it, but then the Senate has to actually approve that, it has to actually ratify the treaty for it to become law, okay? House of Representatives, they do not have any, they have one special power. They have a couple we'll talk about in a second. But spending bills have to start in the House. In recent years, there's been some procedural chicanery that the Senate kind of can do, but we don't need to worry about that. We'll keep it simple. Spending bills, anytime the government wants to spend money, the budget, that's supposed to begin in the House of Representatives. The Senate can propose or concur with amendments, okay? So they can add things to a budget bill, but spending bills are supposed to start in the House of Representatives. And then over there on the side, you see some specific powers that the Congress has. They have the power to override a presidential veto. Okay, so again, the simplest thing that Congress does, they write laws or they write bills. Okay, the bill has to pass both houses. So spending bills are supposed to start in the House. Any other bill can be written and introduced either in the Senate or in the House of Representatives, but both houses have to vote on the bill with a majority for it to even consider becoming law. Then that bill, if it passes both houses, if a majority of people vote in favor of the bill in both Senate and the House of Representatives, it will go to the president to sign it into law. But of course, the president can veto it. The president can refuse to sign it and usually send it back. I mean, it doesn't have to literally send it back, but usually explains why. But the president can veto it. The president can refuse to sign that bill into law, in which case it is not a law. Congress can override the president's veto. It requires a 2/3 vote in each house, okay? And 2/3, it may not sound like that much, but it's actually quite a bit. And it can actually be very difficult to get that, okay? So it's rare that presidential vetoes are overridden, but it is possible, okay? So Congress can override a presidential veto, make a bill a law, even if the president is clearly opposed to it and has tried to veto it. Again, it happens very rarely, but it can. And the Congress can propose a constitutional amendment, okay? How do you amend the Constitution? 2/3 vote in each house to propose an amendment. Then it goes to the states, and 3/4 of the states have to ratify it, usually through votes in their legislatures. President has no role in the amendment process, okay? So Congress has some important power. They can override the president if they get 2/3 vote in each house. They can override a presidential veto. And they can propose a constitutional amendment with a 2/3 vote in each house. Again, this is relatively rare that this happens. The Constitution being successfully amended, that's very rare, right? First 10 amendments come in with the Constitution. Then there's one, I won't go over every amendment, but it's relatively rare and difficult to amend the Constitution, okay? But it starts with Congress, okay? So that's an important power that they have, but again, it requires both houses, okay? Then we have the presidency, obviously, 4-year terms. After a constitutional amendment, after Franklin Roosevelt was elected 4 times, there are 2 terms maximum. If you take over office, if you become president in, with less than 2 years left in a term, you can still run twice, but that's a rare thing that we don't need to worry about. 4-year terms, okay, 2 maximum at this point. Again, they're elected by the Electoral College after a national election. So the idea is, remember, Congress is always tied to a particular area. Senators represent states, representatives represent particular districts within states, but really that district more than anything, even more than their state anyway. The president elected by the whole country is supposed to represent the whole country. That's very much kind of the idea behind part of the presidency, is that the president, the executive, should represent the country as a whole. Legislature, the different members of Congress represent areas, but the president represents the country as a whole, okay? The main, again, the most basic kind of what does the president do in the American political or legal system? Signs bills into law, right? That's the simplest thing you could say the president does. Congress passes these bills, they go to the president signs them, and then they become a law. Or the president can veto them. Again, as we've seen, the veto can be overridden. Again, for right now, we'll keep this very simple. We won't get into other things right now. We'll talk about the presidency in more detail later. Okay, another important thing, though, that the president does, oversees the executive branch. So this isn't even necessarily the president, because of course the executive branch is so large now. The United States government itself covers an entire continent. It has interests all over the world. It's obviously a global power now. So it's not like the president can manage all of these things, but the executive branch which is kind of that part of government that the president is the head of, executes, implements laws. And again, a lot of these important appointments have to be confirmed by the Senate, but a lot of important work is done by the executive branch, maybe at the direction of the president, maybe with a very broad direction from the president. The executive branch, though, is implementing a lot of these laws in a way that often there are judgment calls that they make about how to implement these laws, which are significant too. And some important governing work comes in there, okay? Again, to go back to the president, okay, so you need to understand that the executive branch is a lot more than just the president, and a lot of important things are being done by this massive part of by basically the government, right? But go back to the president nominates federal judges, signs formal treaties, nominates cabinet members and other executive appointments. We've seen that. All these are powers that are shared with the Senate. The president is also often regarded or referred to as the chief diplomat. Basically, if one person represents the United States internationally to other countries, it's the president of the United States, right? The president, much more than any member of Congress, is kind of the chief diplomat, the one person who really represents the United States to other countries. Again, the United States interests all over the world. The president has lots of things to do. So it's not like the president actually negotiates with every single country. There wouldn't be enough time to do that. It's not like the president always represents the United States in every kind of international event. Again, couldn't possibly, okay? So the State Department, which again is part of the executive branch, a lot of important things happen that do not directly involve the president, but an important role for the president is as this kind of chief diplomat, this chief person who kind of represents the United States internationally. And of course, sometimes that's not just a matter of sitting down and negotiating with another head of state. It's also just the image and the kind of persona and the stature that the president projects internationally. That's an important part of the role of what the president is doing, okay? Not necessarily spelled out in the Constitution, but the way that it's developed, certainly. Okay, so then finally, the judiciary. Federal judges, again, we talked about, nominated by the president, confirmed by the Senate. They have lifetime tenure. That means that basically they cannot be removed by office. They're completely independent after confirmation. They can be impeached. It's extremely rare. It's very difficult to do it. Effectively, they cannot be removed from office. I mean, we've seen it recently. Justices dying in office. You know, even when you wonder if their health is not good, you can't force them to retire. You certainly can't remove them. And that's very much by design, right? The notion was you don't want the judges who are supposed to rule on whether or not laws are constitutional to be dependent on either of the other branches of government for staying in power. Nor do you want them dependent on the people through elections, okay? So the whole idea is it's supposed to be an independent judiciary. The federal judges, Supreme Court is kind of the highest profile, the most well known, but there are a lot of other federal judges, and those are also very important appointments, actually. They don't get nearly as much attention oftentimes in the media or whatever as the Supreme Court itself, but all of these federal judges are pretty important positions. But let's just talk about the Supreme Court again, just to keep it simple, okay? The notion is they should be independent. They get in there, there's a process to get through, it's somewhat difficult. President chooses you, the Senate has to confirm you. And some of these recent appointments have gotten a lot of attention. But once you're in their lifetime tenure, the notion is for them to be completely independent. And they rule whether or not laws are constitutional. Now, when a law is passed, it's not just sent to the Supreme Court or to a group of federal judges or whatever to rule on whether or not it's constitutional. The law has to actually be challenged, and it has to go to them in a court case, okay? So this is called judicial review. Their basic power is called judicial review. They have the power as judges to review laws and decide whether or not they're constitutional, okay? But again, they don't automatically do it. These laws have to be challenged. They have to be kind of brought into court for the judges to rule, to actually decide on this. And they're often, in many ways, they're very weak, okay? They don't have any power over budget. They don't have any power over enforcement. So they can make these rulings, but they are really dependent on the other branches to enforce them. Whether that's through budgetary things like Congress can pass then a budget that can pass laws that say if people don't abide by this particular Supreme Court decision, they won't receive funding here or there, or they can refuse to fund programs that aren't in accord with the Supreme Court decision. And obviously the president can act to, if necessary, can use different types of law enforcement or even military personnel to carry out Supreme Court decisions, okay? So they have this power to say what's constitutional and what's not, but they don't really have any power to do anything about it. And that way they're reliant on the other branches, okay? And there you see the basic structure: district courts, court of appeals, Supreme Court. District courts usually more kind of a finding of fact. The Court of Appeals a little bit more focused on, that's where you start to get into more legal questions or constitutional questions. The Supreme Court really only hears constitutional cases. And of course, they can hear appeals from the Federal Court of Appeals. They can also hear appeals from the states. So the Supreme Court can actually decide that state constitutions violate the national constitution, and in that case, whatever provision of a state constitution the Supreme Court has decided is unconstitutional by the federal constitution, that then no longer has the force of law. Again, not a lot they can do to enforce it, and at different points in history, people have not always been so deferential to the Supreme Court. Now there's pretty much a view that what judges say the Constitution means, that's what it means. In parts of the 19th century, there wasn't necessarily that much agreement about that. There was some, people didn't always defer to the judges, but that's, we don't need to get into all that right now. Okay, so that's the basic power that the judiciary has. Here is a, I guess maybe a flow chart would be a little bit better, but this is kind of what Blackboard has pre-programmed or whatever. Okay, so there you see the different parts of government. Again, the basic idea of checks and balances. Congress writes bills, okay? Then they can send it to the president, who either signs it into law or can veto it and send it back to Congress, at which point Congress can override the veto if they have a vote, if they have the votes. If 2/3 of each house votes to override the veto, they can. Again, doesn't often happen. So the president either signs the bill into law or vetoes it, and again, oversees execution of the law through the executive branch agencies. Again, the president is not personally sitting there watching what each agency is doing, right? That would be far too much work. They have far too much to do, couldn't possibly keep up with all of that. But ultimately, these people report to the president, and the president does have some oversight, or has all the oversight. How much they're actually able to exercise is another thing, right? Congress also has oversight powers over the president, but it's a little bit unclear what that always means. And it's, again, keeping it simple. So Congress writes the bills, the president signs it into law, it's a law. Or Congress writes a bill, sends it to the president vetoes it, and that's it, it's not a law. Or Congress writes a bill, signs it to the president vetoes it, and Congress overrides the veto, and it becomes a law even though the president tried to veto it. In any case, once the law is out there, so again, somebody has to challenge it. They actually have to go to court and say, like, oftentimes they've broken the law and been convicted, and they challenge not whether or not they did that, but they challenge whether or not it's constitutional. And it has to be someone who's been directly affected by it. You can't just challenge, you actually have to be arrested or whatever. You have to be directly affected by the law. You can't just challenge it in principle. And then it goes to the federal judiciary. The judiciary can review the acts of the other branches of government, Congress, president, executive orders. We don't need to talk about that right now, but that's something that can also be reviewed by the courts. Also state laws, again, even state constitutions. They have to be challenged in court to actually go there. Congress can't, or the judiciary, the Supreme Court, federal courts of any kind, can't just initiate this process themselves. And then again, they rely on the other branches to enforce their rulings. So Congress writes a bill, president signs it into law, somebody challenges it, it goes to the judiciary. The Supreme Court rules that it is constitutional. There it is. It's a valid law. It will be a law, forever until it's repealed, or which often happens with laws. Eventually, it starts to seem kind of irrelevant. People don't really. Sometimes they have sunset clauses. Sometimes they have a specific limitation on how long the law will apply. Other times they're kind of superseded by later laws. But maybe it's a long-term law. Congress writes a bill, sends it to the president vetoes it. Congress can't override the veto. It's not a law. Congress overrides the veto. Somebody challenges it. It goes to the judiciary. They decide again. Maybe they say it's constitutional. Again, it remains a law. Maybe they say it's unconstitutional, and then it's not supposed to be a law. But again, then it also depends if they need some kind of enforcement mechanism. The judiciary itself does not have that. Okay. So there's a very basic visual representation of checks and balances. Okay, hopefully that is somewhat useful. And that is just an overview of the introduction to the class, and we will continue then with, in the future here with other things.